I'd like to start by introducing a few characters who feature in some of my recent works. And these characters share an insatiable quest for knowledge and exploration. And these are things that are common to them. And these historical players are usually fashioned on existing personalities. So De Brazza, the explorer, Luis Primero, and most recently the libro de todo universo, embody a certain adaptive quality and what in the animal world is called versipelis, which is the ability to change your skin or to don a new coat for the occasion. And these shape-shifting characters, these confident men or people, take on their roles in these narratives that I write through an image-making practice which spans photography, film, a moving picture, and installation. And it's also these shape-shifting characteristics that connect to me to a logic of illusion-making and kind of basics on the pictorial plane and problems of images. And these, for me, are evoked in my fascination with the histories of the practice of studio photography, trompe-l'œil in the case of painting, and cinema. So as I titled this talk, this dressing up as if, this kind of playing, stepping into a character, is both content that I use, but also a certain logic, which I approach the work that I've been making more recently. Pierre Bourdieu describes a notion of illusio, which is a concept which is a certain willingness to be complicit in the game of society. And so when thinking through these characters, I always think of them in terms of them playing certain roles as they go through the narratives, but as a kind of microcosm of larger socio-political concerns. And Pierre Bourdieu says that this willingness to go on with the game and accepting this power system is part of playing out the fictions of this game of society. And so the characters in the selected works today highlights these fictions, and they accentuate certain thresholds, be they economic, political, geographic, or mythological. And so as Merlini mentioned, I will present two recent works, the first being the most recent, the Libro de todo universo, and from this year, 2015, and Zero Latitude from 2014. So I will just, as a way of introduction, show you a short prologue, which introduces three of the characters in this larger narrative. And so just give me a sec to get this over to the right window.
Do you see that man sitting in the background? He told me that this is precisely the spot where Luís I or Luís Filipe Maria Fernando Pedro de Alcântara António Miguel Rafael Gabriel Gonzaga Xavier Francisco de Assis João Augusto Júlio Valfano de Sache Coburgo Gota e Bragança sat. He sat there following his induction as the first honorary president of the Geographical Society. It was at this very spot, concealed behind a column, that Louis realized that he had little interest whatsoever in the maps that are housed in this ornate setting. Louis probably preferred the literary life to politics and public affairs. He did, however, delight in having drinks in the convivium. The maps for him were mere abstract codes of journeys that tamed life. Journeys much like those of his tragic hero, enter Hamlet, another monarch, weighing up truth against beauty.
How long is the film in total?
This is just the prologue, so the film is not finished yet. So this project is Libro de Todo Universo is a starting point, and in the prologue it introduces three characters. You have Luís I with a really long name, the King of Portugal, who during his tenure as the honorary president of the Geographical Society, he embarks on translating Hamlet. And so the work looks at a part of Hamlet where these huge slippages in the translation become very visible. And so using this confidant, this circular sofa as a kind of universe, the camera circles around this point. In the first 180 degrees, you have the action, the famous Mousetrap Scene, which is the play within the play, recited in English on the first 180 degrees, and then as you go around in Portuguese. So this translation was published in 1877 by the National Press, and the work is shot here on site in Lisbon at the Geographical Society. And this conversation between Ophelia and Hamlet takes place. So it has been shown as a prologue and as a way to kind of introduce the character of the royal translator, who embodies, as the prologue suggests, this kind of tension between truth and beauty, and trying to establish a link between the act of mapping and the act of translation. As the etymology of the word translation suggests, it's a crossing of space, translation. So there is a similarity between taking one medium, one language, and then moving it into another language, or in the case of mapping, taking a physical space, abstracting that, and making it into a graphic space. And so this kind of interest in cartography is also something that reappears, especially in the way that these narratives take part in these sites, like the Geographical Society of Lisbon. So here you would see the two texts. And so the major difference that you can see already in the first line is that if you can read Portuguese, Ophelia's lap becomes her feet in the Portuguese. So even without understanding anything of either languages, you can quite clearly see the shift in the choreography. So, as I mentioned before, Luís I is a kind of narrative stand-in for this tension between the two worlds, the world of literature and the world of politics through mapping. And through working through this script, as we can call it a script, although I rarely make real scripts, I intuited and named the project the Libro de Todo Universo before. And so I began to think about the libro as a character, as a kind of subject in the narrative. And so I started to think how that libro could be embodied, and how I could breathe life into this inanimate object. And I happened to be in Antwerp following my time in Lisbon, And I spent a lot of time in a very beautiful museum called the Plantain Mauritius Museum, which is a museum of printing. And it was a very famous imprint for about 200 years, printing and innovating Western, knowledge production in the very literal sense. And so when I was thinking through this kind of idea of a book that could contain the universe, I was thinking about what form that could take. And by chance or by luck, I stumbled upon this very beautiful poem, which is constructed of 8 words. And it's a Latin poem that was published in the 17th century by the imprint Plantain Mauritius, by a certain Jesuit monk. And the poem, it's not really evident here, but it has the ability to produce 1,022 iterations of the same sentence just by combining the words. So it came out of a tradition of Latin epigrams, but this was kind of the most elaborate of them. And so what is even more beautiful about the poem is that this monk decided not to express the iterations, but he left it just as these 8 words and with a subtext that said, this has the possibility or the potentiality to combine to form 1,022 iterations.
But like each iteration would still have a meaning.
Yes, so this is...
not going to observe.
No, because this is something that's peculiar to the Latin language. I've learned is that it doesn't the sentence which the meaning is virgin. You have as many virtues as there are stars in the sky. So the interesting thing is that the 1,022 iterations were the number of stars in Ptolemy's atlas at that time. So in a way, it is already a universal system. And so with Latin, it doesn't matter. Because of the subject verb, you can move those, the syntax. If you change the syntax, the meaning doesn't change. So in essence, in actuality, you could never translate this poem into any other language because other languages are reliant on specific order of subject and verb. And so this monk, Balhusius, decided not to do the iterations and kind of teased the reader, saying that it has the potential. And then, of course, 2 years later, another monk painstakingly decided to go through the iterations. And so he kind of created this graphic exercise of going through the 1,022 iterations. And he introduced the work by saying "que varietas evolupto," like how voluptuous variety is. And he called this kind of poem a protean poem, which for me was interesting in terms of the kind of mythological figure, which, as I mentioned earlier, kind of is embodiment of the shape-shifting character. So Proteus has this ability to change its form to form different versions of itself, and also was a very big symbol of the Baroque, with this ability to have so many variations. And so I found that this would be a very interesting mental model or kind of form to explore in terms of a way to breathe life into this inanimate book. And so as Melanie mentioned, a few weeks ago in Antwerp, in the Plantain Mauritius, in this very specific room, which is the Correcteurskamer, or the proofreader's room, where in pairs the proofreader and the typesetter would sit, and they would read every book that was ready to be published. And so through reading, they would spot the errors. So it was an oral exercise. So they would sit. It's a bit dark on this projection, but they would sit across from each other on this very heavy wooden bench, and so they would in fact, read everything that would go to print. And so I found it was a very interesting act to kind of think about the oral potential of these words and not just the printed one. And also to think a bit how thought was influenced by printing. So before printing, text was always related to the body in the form of manuscripts or in the oral tradition. But at the point that printing became popularized and mechanized, everything then was laid flat and reproduced. So when the viewer would arrived at the Plantain Mauritius Museum, they would walk through the printing workshops, which were quite important at the time, and they would arrive into the corrector's Kamer, a room which was privy to all the errors of all the material that was made in that room. So I worked with a performer, Cecilia Elicheche, who is a choreographer from Argentina, but is based in Brussels. And we started to think about a process of insufflation. I don't know if you've ever heard this term, but it's a way that you can be possessed, and that is by the breath. And so while we were sitting there, we kind of were thinking about all these words kind of essentially were floating in the space. And so the Book of the Universe was as if she was a kind of medium and was breathing the book. And so so we worked on a rhythm to kind of use the Protean poem as a basis to kind of breathe the other works. And I really love this quote by Anne Carson, who's a scholar and writer of the classics, and she said, a listener listening to an oral recitation, as Hermann Fraenkel puts it, is an open force field, into whom sounds are being breathed in a continuous stream from the poet's mouth. Written words, on the other hand, do not present such an all-persuasive sensual phenomenon. Literacy desensorizes words and the reader. So Cecilia read 1,020 iterations and to form this rhythmical heartbeat. And my first intention was to make, it was a very complex way to make a soundtrack. So we decided that it would in fact be for an audience. So it was for one sitting, and we read 1,022 iterations, which took about 2 hours and 40 minutes. And so with the installation, I worked with Christoph, who's sitting in the back there, and I really wanted that each word had its own dedicated speaker, so that each word would have one, so there were 8 speakers in the space. And I was really bent on having one word per speaker, but of course it was quite complex to do that with an algorithm. And so actually in the end, Christoph in the back, he played the speakers. So we had a MIDI keyboard, which in each key had one of the words. So every time it was tot or TB, he would output it to the relative speaker. And there you can see a detail of the speaker, and it's quite a nice coincidence that there's a painting by Rubens of Doubting Thomas in the corrector's room. So it really kind of the human error really comes back into the process, even though it's very much a site for innovation and the industrialization of print. So the project is still in process, and it's kind of quite usual that I take these steps. But in the soundtrack that was produced through the performance will now become the life of the character, the livro, who will figure into the grander narrative between Hamlet, Ophelia, and King Louis I, as a means to think about the Book of the Universe and this quest for knowledge in general. So linking the port cities of Antwerp and Lisbon think about this kind of modern world, and also how the exploration of the so-called new world was happening contemporaneously to the innovation of printing. So those are the kind of the nodes that I've been working on. Perhaps I'll pause here. I'm not sure if it makes more sense to address questions about this project now and then to go on to the next one, or if you prefer to do all at the end, because you might forget. Anyone? No? Okay, so sure.
I was just wondering, you were talking about like in the action of translation, you automatically have these slippages. And I was wondering like where you locate the slippages in your own work, or if you're like aware of them, or if you consciously implement them, or if they happen naturally, or like through using this historical material, which is also a form of translation. And I just wonder, or because you talk about this idea of error and slippages, and I just wondered if like how you deal with these, how you yourself see yourself as a translator, how you deal with this idea of translating as an artist.
Yeah, well, for me, it's quite important to stick within the realm of fiction, and so that even though the material is based somewhat on historical facts, I use it as material, and so I don't take responsibility to necessarily be the historian to be true to the facts. So in the act of my act of translation, I would imagine would be kind of by putting these series of narratives together in the same field, kind of new meaning or new translations occur. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I think that it's that I try to of course be accurate with what I take, but it's always based on the kind of personal desire to create a narrative. So it's kind of driven by my impulse that these things come together. So there is this kind of fingerprint, as with the Luis Primero translation. There's a kind of his fingerprint is in the text, and hopefully, the kind of my fingerprint is in the works, through even though they're historical references.
And then the choice to make it into a performance, was that like an attempt to bring back the body in this process of printmaking and text?
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to produce the sound with a body. I mean, a sound as a kind of as Cecilia as an instrument, as a medium for this book, and so it was something unique, and it's not something I've worked with before. I've usually used, worked with actors in studio or on camera. So I had to do it anyway. So I decided to open it for an audience to see how that would change also what I was doing. And it was very interesting because, of course, by setting out to make it in one go, you are also working with the human body, which has exhaustion and coughs and all sorts of other elements which you can avoid in the studio by doing it in takes and re-editing. So there was something quite also arduous in the fact that she did it like for 2 hours and 40 minutes and we recorded it. So there's something special in the sound that you couldn't necessarily get in the studio.
How many stars are there now?
There are loads, a big number that I can't remember in one as easily as 1,022.
Yeah, it's also kind of like an interesting transition.
Yeah, like a loads
like
more.
how these truths are like how
Shifting.
knowledge kind of like shifts.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you have any boundaries of where this project will end, or could it potentially, you could keep collecting characters and situations to build this knowledge of the universe in one book?
Yeah, I mean, this is a new project, so I guess because it's kind of, as it's titled, it could be a container for everything. But it's, I usually see my bodies of work. They have different iterations and different ways that I install them in projects. So for me, with the Libro de Todo Universo, I see it as these 5 characters interacting, and then in Zero Latitude you maybe have others, but I wouldn't necessarily see those characters ever crossing space-time reality in a new narrative. Oh, at least now. So for now they have existed within their kind of sets. Okay, so I'll move on. A lot of my thinking earlier was also looking at sites of knowledge, but also physical sites that kind of had that was spaces outside of everyday life. So be they institutional spaces or also geographical spaces. And so I kind of set out to think further at how to define these spaces that resist definition, and was thinking about how explorers and people who are engaged with this pursuit for knowledge delineate new territories, and where new rules apply. So when you kind of make knowledge, you kind of set the parameters as to what you are doing. And so I had this tension between a kind of physical location, so how could you locate that space physically, and a more kind of imaginary space of knowledge. And so I came to this term Zero Latitude through a text actually by Deleuze on cinema, where he describes spaces, especially in cinematic spaces, that resist definition. And so this term stuck with me for quite some time, and this idea of a zero point and also a conceptual null zone. And further to this kind of interest in pictorial space and how you can create dimensions within a flat surface, I was thinking where could I locate zero latitude in terms of what I was thinking. And so at that time, it kind of was a very strange logic, but I said, okay, zero latitude is the equator, and for me the equator is Congo. So it was a kind of a really shoddy logic. And so this is pretty much how the title came. And so actually the title, like with the Libro de Todo Universo, came first. And so I was thinking, okay, well, I can't make a trip to zero latitude, to Congo. And so at the time, the next best thing was Belgium, which is kind of a joke if you think about it. So I went to the Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren, and I wasn't sure really what I was looking for, but I was kind of trying to elaborate this idea of a zero latitude. And I started out by reading the accounts of the traveler Henry Morton Stanley, who was working for Leopold at the time. And he kept making mention of this another explorer as this dandy, this very handsome, disheveled man who never wore any shoes. And I got really fascinated by this character who was a kind of stereotype of the explorer. And so I went on further, and then I kind of met De Brazza, who's the first image that I showed earlier. So De Brazza was a French, well, an Italian naturalized French explorer who worked for the French colonial project at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And so following Henry Morton Stanley's accounts, I got to know a bit more about his expedition, but also more strangely, an object which he commissioned, which is the object you see in the film, which is it's called the Louis Vuitton Explorateur, which is kind of like an anglicization of explorateur in French. And this product was commissioned by De Brazza for his expedition to Congo. So I mean, despite it being an extremely beautiful object, I started to think through this object in terms of what it contains and how this kind of fantasy of the space that this man had never explored was contained in this object. And so as it was presented here in the Berlin Biennial in the Kunstwerke, it was shown in 3 elements. The large projection of the film, smaller prints on the right, and I will show you details of those in a minute. But I think I will first show you the film or excerpts of the film. It was shown as a loop, and so you can get a sense of the object first. There isn't any sound. So I'll just talk over it a bit to give you a bit of a few more details. So the object is part of the collection of Musée Quai Branly. So we were not able to take it out of the museum, and so we built a infinity curve inside the basement of the museum. And so once we got it out of storage, we set it up. And so also the choice to shoot it on an infinity curve, of course, is this kind of doubling of this idea of the 0 point, a space that is kind of suspended, and also, of course, very prominent in studio photography. And so it's shot in two long shots. So that we first have the plan view, and then later the section view. And so you have 2 characters who basically unpack and reassemble the object. So it's a kind of unboxing of this product. So the object was commissioned by De Brazza, and then later Vuitton tried to put it into production for well-to-do explorers of the jungle at the time. But it wasn't really successful, and so actually I had seen another one, but I really wanted to work with the object that made the journey. So you can also see now, especially that it was very much used.
So is there like an account of how many journeys he made with it?
Not specific. He doesn't really mention it. Of course, he has they have these lists of their equipment and what they took. But he did 3 journeys in total, so it's not sure how many expeditions it went. I'll just scrub along to the other view, so you can see the section view of the same action.
How did you manage to get the permission to do this?
It took a long time, firstly, and I started work on this project quite a lot. I started more research, which was book research and internet research. And so at first I saw another example. So I approached Louis Vuitton, and I went in Paris. They have a kind of collection of all their bags, because they also have a research department. And so I first saw another example of this object. And then I decided it was important that the real object, the one that had made the journey, so I continued to find out where it was, and it was in this museum collection. So it wasn't in the display, so we had to negotiate to get it out. And so at that point, it was commissioned for the Berlin Biennial. So it was also easier, perhaps, with some institutional support. Not really, but it was a lot of just office work and trying to convince them that I wasn't criticizing the French colonial project. But it happened and it worked. And so we had one day to shoot, which is very stressful, especially in a museum context, because of course this object, you can't just move it around, and you have to ask them to move it if you want to retake the shot. So there were of course limitations in what we could do. And so that's what we did our best by creating a studio in the space. Yeah.
Maybe you can say something about the people who are handling it.
Mm-hmm. So they are. So obviously, I couldn't have actors working with this object because they are not professionals. They are not professional artifact handlers. So I had to do a casting with the museum staff, but they were cast and they were also styled. So they had to also be open to wearing what I would want them to wear. So that was a kind of interesting play between kind of the real, museum world and the kind of set and the filmic space which we created. So perhaps I'll show you the other objects so you can see how it worked in the installation. Does that work? Yes, wow. So I'll show you details of the other objects. This is a different installation, which was just in Braunschweig, in Kunstverein. It just closed a few weeks ago. And these are the details. So if you, these are two sea prints, which are details of the fur of a monkey. So if you look at the installation, you have the three elements. And these objects also happen, they work as a scale to kind of, if you looked at the whole room as a map, these objects would act as a scale reference or a legend. And so each piece, in the way that I speak about it, is a character in this narrative. So you have the explorator, which is the bed, De Bratze, which is the small prince, which I showed you now, and the third element, which is the river. And De Bratze, which are these, is the name of the explorer, but is also the name of a species of monkey that the explorer gave his name to. And so it became an interesting kind of shift between the man and his ape equivalent. And I kind of imagined how it would be if, how did he choose which species to name after himself. And so it also became a metaphor for the speciesism of the 19th century, this kind of urge to kind of classify and name things, which would then go on to lead to justifications of racism and colonialism. So for me, it was interesting tension between the man and his ape equivalent. And so these are, as I mentioned, sea prints, but also framed in wenge, which is a dark hardwood from the tropical region. And this is a third element, which is a large textile print, which is 3 by 4 meters, and it is based on a portrait which was commissioned also before by de Bratza before setting out on his trip. He approached Nadar, the very famous portraitist of the time, and he made a portrait in the studio upon a backdrop. And this image was described also by Roland Barthes as an exemplary image, as a photograph, which really showed the punctum in a very clear way. And so when I was looking at this image, I became more interested in the background and thinking about the river, the Congo River, as the setting for for this action to unfold, and also to think about the Congo River more generally as the kind of access point for the West, like physically through the Atlantic, but also in the imagination, in terms of how an image of a space which has never been visited was created. And so what I did was I went to the Nadar archive and looked through all the glass plate negatives to find all the subjects that were taken on the same background. And so literally removing the subjects, I reconstituted the horizon line to again bring to the fore this idea of this constructed landscape. And so the river in this narrative is a narrative stand-in for Africa as a whole, and the kind of Western stereotype of what the so-called dark heart looked like. And then further to the installation, which were the three elements, I also worked on a publication, which is a online publication, which is a collection of all the images. And so, as I said before, the process took over 2 years. It took 2 years to create. So I also collected many images along the way, and so I wanted to find a way to kind of create these maps of these narratives. So these, you can have a look at them. There are different ones that you can choose, and you can literally go around the surface of these large images to kind of navigate this space, the space that is of zero latitude. So I think I will leave it there. We are kind of really punctual. I heard that this was so very punctual. So we have some time for discussion, and please feel at ease and ask away. You can ask in German, and Melanie can help translate. Maybe I'm just signing her up for a translator.
I'm definitely the best person. What's Justin Bieber doing there?
What's Justin Bieber doing there? Well, when thinking about this relationship between man and his ape equivalent, I kind of became obsessed with all these different people and that have monkeys as pets. And at the time, Justin Bieber was stopped in Munich in the customs because he didn't have the right document for the beast, and so it was confiscated and ended up in the zoo in Munich. So it was kind of polemical at the time, and that is an image from his Instagram feed. So it became it was really just it happened to be at the time. And above it you see, maybe you don't see so clearly, but it's Michelangelo's Dying Slave, which I'm not sure if you remember, but at the base of the slave you have a monkey, and in the kind of classical symbolism, the monkey was used as a symbol of the artifice, because it was something that was aping, it was pretending to be like a man but wasn't really. So in this kind of Platonic sense, it was kind of bad, or was one step away, because it was faking and not really the man itself. So I kind of was thinking about the ape and also this action to ape, to play something in this kind of, also in the way that I think about this idea of dressing up as if, like playing man or playing ape.
would you see it as a form of like dehumanization? Like in the last project, there's this tendency to erase the human figure, like literally in the photographic piece, but then also kind of in the video where you kind of like decapitate the people who are like handling the object, and then I was just wondering like how if that's like an important feature of kind of like erasing the human as a figure, and maybe only let him be present as a metaphor or as a tool or as a like how do you deal with this like man, or like maybe elaborate your idea
exactly.
on the man-animal distinction and nature-culture distinction.
Yeah, well, this is also because at this point, this kind of at the 0 point, and I was thinking about this kind of the arbitrary line, and also like the 0 latitude and the horizon as this kind of line between man and nature, or sky and sea, or north and south. You know, you can kind of extend that metaphor forever. But it was conscious that like de Bruyt's are never figures as himself. It's always this kind of reversal. So in the case of the bed, you have the shift between the subject to the object, his personal affects. In this case, there's this shift between the figure and the ground. So, and then in the case of the monkey, the kind of he takes the name of his man equivalent. So there is indeed a kind of shifting of those binaries in this work. And so as I mentioned, it was at that time it was really the beginning of the speciesism of the 19th century, this kind of really the beginning of this scientific impulse to categorize, delineate, map, and that would then affect how knowledge or how truth would be held in centuries that followed. So yes, it is conscious.
How you inform the visitors? So you told that in one room these three staff belonging to each other, and how much of the heard informations were written somewhere, or you gave a sheet of paper? How you?
The work, I guess for me, it's important that it functions on both levels. I mean, it is very formal, and it operates as works in themselves in the way that I'm using like pictorial like conventions or playing with them. But then where the work has been shown in institutional spaces which have the kind of the title and the catalogue or the guidebook or all these other material that exists. So besides that material, I didn't add any, and that for me it was also important to take the publication into another site, and so that the work can be read first only as it is here, or maybe you only encounter the website, or maybe you only hear me talk, and so that these kind of nodes can add more or less meaning depending how you approach it, because in the end it is kind of a myth or a narrative that I'm creating. So I don't want it to be kind of to really guide the unfolding of that narrative. So, but I do take responsibility for the content, because it is also important in terms of kind of discussions around the post-colonial, and so that is why the publication exists for me in this kind of constellation.
I was wondering, with in the films, you seem to use oftentimes these kind of like slow tracking shots, kind of like, and I was wondering if you see this as something cinematic or more as something descriptive, where you just want to give a kind of like space for the viewer to understand what is going on. Is that more like out of a cinematic aesthetics, or more kind of like informative?
Yeah, I think I mean, I think it's definitely a formal decision, and I showed you this this animation right at the beginning, which is a kind of is it playing now? I can't see. Sometimes it's difficult to tell. Yeah, it's playing now. Yeah, it became a metaphor for this kind of the equator and orbiting and creating worlds, and the same with the libro de todo universo. I was thinking about the universe and how, you know, the center of the confidant is a kind of an axis that the camera moves around. So it is formal, so it does contain this reading in it. So it's not arbitrary, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, no, more like how, like the camera movements.
Mm-hmm.
If they function as a description,
Mm-hmm.
or if they function as something that is more subjective, or like cinematic, or like the rhythm of the camera.
I think it's a bit of both, like, to be honest. Yeah. But I mean, at first I was thinking about, I mean, I made this animation first because I was thinking about the Earth, and I made this silly animation with the equator line, and so that's kind of where this movement came from. Of course, in zero latitude it isn't a full circle, and just also because sometimes technically you can't make perfect ellipsoids like you can in 3D. So. Any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
On the internet site, is it always on?
Yes.
It's something that is ongoing.
Mm-hmm.
Is something that is finished, or that you...
Oh no, so yes, it is finished. So as far as like zero latitude is concerned, I see it as a project from last year that has these elements, and I have shown it in different ways. So also based on technical decisions or other works, so it hasn't necessarily always been it always has the elements, but not necessarily in the same. So I see them as these kind of elements that can be that can shift, and kind of like pawns. You can put them in different constellations or arrangements. Yeah.
But it belongs to that work, and since that work is finished, so that it's always...
Yeah, so I would say, as I said before, yeah. So that's those characters or elements, and then in the next one you have various ones. Yeah.
And is it the first time that you used also an external virtual platform, or did you do that already?
I have done it more kind of maybe more informally. Like I have made Tumblrs, or also the way that I catalog my images generally are by tags. So I have like my Evernote or whatever file in my hard drive that kind of you would look for jungle, and then you would have like a whole like selection of images. So that's also kind of how I dealt with these images. So and there are images from various sources. So some of them are film, and some of them are digital, and some of them are stolen from Justin Bieber's Instagram or whatever, and then they all kind of flattened into the surface of this map. Mm-hmm.
In the proofreading room,
Mm-hmm.
there was this letterpress and the person reading out loud.
Mm-hmm.
Like, was there anything that would have represented a mistake while she was reading? Because you read the book out loud to find mistakes in the writing.
I'm not sure if I understand. Do you mean the historical, the
Well,
proofreaders, or in the performance?
Was there something that would have represented a
The-
mistake?
Yeah, well, the thing that happened was because Christoph was outputting the sound manually, there were errors. So sometimes you would be next to a speaker that was always saying the same, and then all of a sudden maybe it changed because there was, but you wouldn't be able to, unless you happen to experience it, it wasn't kind of highlighted.
Would it be the same too if we were reading a book?
So it will be what?
You might not be able to see things later, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. Or if you did, you would read it as, correct anyway. Yeah, so in a sense, they would have done every book would have been read every time before it was published. So it was quite a task. And in that room, you can see that they had, because of course it was very dark in those times, but you can see from the side there's natural light, so it was also would have been limited, I guess, to certain times of the day. And yeah. Okay, so if there aren't any further pressing questions, then we'll leave it there. Thank you.